Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers. In this continuing Arctic forest creation series, I'm going to show you how to texture your landscape and use procedural foliage techniques to create trees and rocks that blend in with the landscape. Let's get straight into it. Before we create our trees and our rocks in our Arctic forest, let's update the textures on our landscape. We only have two textures to worry about now, the snow on the hills and the floor of the landscape, but I want both of them to be snowy. So let's go to Quixel Megascans and grab a couple of textures and apply them. So go to your add menu, go to Quixel Bridge, and what we'll do first is we'll search for fresh windswept snow, and you'll see there's actually quite a lot of different variations of snow here, all with very similar names. But this first one here with the sort of pattern in the equator is the one I'm going to use. So we'll pick this one and so click on it and choose high quality and add that to your landscape, or add it to your project I should say. Come out of here, let's also search for, let's clear this search, we'll also search for sleet covered gravel, and you'll find this one, which is snow with a little bit of stone underneath. So select that one. Again, I'm going for high quality here. You can download it if you haven't downloaded already, and then click add to your project. So now we have the two new textures in our Arctic forest project. So you can shut down Bridge now, and we're going to apply these to the landscape using the Open Land Megascan widget, which is nice and quick for changing textures. But before we can apply it, we need to make sure that our landscape can accept dynamic changes. So go to your landscape in the outliner, choose dynamic and check use dynamic material instance. And now any changes we do in the widget will be applied directly. Okay, now go to your content browser, go to Open Land, widgets, and you see this Open Land Megascan texture selector widget. So right click here and run the widget. Yours might appear in the middle of the screen. I've just docked mine to the right side of the screen here. So you can drag yours and dock it over there if you want. So as I said, there's only two textures we can change. We changed the slope bias so that effectively there's just snow and slope in our landscape. So let's choose the top layer first, and then in our Megascan texture selector we'll choose the fresh windswept snow, and then once you click select it will apply it to the landscape. So you can see now our snow has got purer with some of those irregularities in the texture. Okay, let's change some of the other settings here as well. So we'll leave the tiling of 4 and 20. That seemed to work well for me. Next thing we can do is we can do a bit of variation in the tint. So at the moment you'll see that it's pure white all the way across the landscape, which might be what you want, but I like to have a little bit of variation to add sort of realism. So I'm gonna, if I pull this up to the top value of 1, you can see that it becomes extremely mottled. I don't want it that dirty because now it doesn't look like it's pure snow. So let's put it somewhere in the middle. I'm going to actually do 0.44, and that way I've got a bit of variation here. So the other thing I'm going to do here as well is, although it's not clear from far away, when you get closer up you might see some of the regularity of those patterns. So if you come down to this bottom of this widget, we can put the rotation and scale variation up to 1, and that will rotate and vary the scale of the textures around the landscape so you don't see any repeating patterns. So that's fine for our top texture. Now let's change this ground texture here so that it's our sleet covered gravel. So go to your slope layer and choose the sleet covered gravel and click on select, and you see now our bottom texture changes as well. And so again, we want to do some variations here as well. You can see there's a little bit of obvious repetition here. First of all, I'm going to make the far tiling 80. So you see that it makes that repetition less visible from this far view, and when I get up close it will be tiled in a way that seems realistic close up as well. And as before, I want to do some variations, so let's put the tint variation intensity all the way up to 1, and I actually quite like that. It creates a sort of variation across the textures without looking too obvious. And again, like before, let's vary the rotation and scale around the landscape as well. And there you go. We have a varied, natural looking texture that's pretty much all snow with a little bit of sort of sleet showing underneath. So I think we'll call the texturing done here, and let's move on to creating our foliage or our trees. Before we can create any trees in our landscape, we first need to get the asset from the Unreal Marketplace. So if you open that up using the Unreal Marketplace option here, and once you're in the marketplace, search for spruce, and you'll find this temperate vegetation spruce, which is completely free. And so we want to add that to our project and use this. Now it looks as though it's lush and green here, but as we'll see when we get it into our landscape, you can see in the screenshot there's a wintry view, so it comes with winter materials as well. So perfect for what we're doing. So let's click add to project, choose the project that you're using, add to project, and after it's downloaded it will transfer everything you need over to the content browser. Once that's done, if you go into your content, you'll have this new folder, Interactive Spruce Forest, with various blueprints, meshes, materials, example maps and the like. So there's an important thing we need to do before we create our foliage here. Now I'm going to use procedural foliage volumes to do this. I've talked about this in early tutorials about the 3 different ways of creating foliage. But procedural foliage is a great way of creating natural looking grass and trees across a wide area, because it uses the way, or it emulates the way that nature creates trees and grass. So growing over a number of years, starting off small, growing in the shade of other trees. So you'll end up with nice natural looking results. So we first of all need to pick the tree or trees that we want. But before we do that, the first important thing that we must do to use procedural foliage is enable it in the editor settings. So go to Edit, Editor Preferences, search for Proceed, and you'll find this procedural foliage. Make sure you check that before you do anything else. Otherwise, all the parameters in the foliage type that we need to set will not be displayed. So set that first over here, and then, as I said, we need to select the tree or trees that we want to put in the landscape. So open up your content browser, go to the meshes, and you'll see there's a variety of different tree types: full trees, half-sized trees, and small trees. So I've gone in my example for half-size high poly trees. and I went for this spruce half 03. Now the reason I went for this is because the leaves don't come all the way down to the ground level, so it's good if you want to have a character running around, because there'll be trunks that they can run in between. If you want to have just purely cinematic use, you might want to go for the ones that come down to the ground level as well, where you don't have to worry about them getting in the way of players. So we need to create a foliage type for this mesh, and the easiest way to do that is to go into foliage mode here, select the tree that we want, in this case the spruce half 03, and drag it up here until it highlights and drop it in. And that will create a foliage type here, but it's not yet saved. So what we need to do is save that asset, and we can save it. It'll default to the same folder. That's fine. We'll leave it there. You see it's now called the mesh name suffixed by foliage type. So click on save there, and that's done. So let's now open up, let's go back to our main mode up here, select. So now we have this foliage type here. Let's open it up. And actually what we'll do is we'll stick this on the right hand side of the screen so that we can see everything at the same time. Let's just move that over slightly. And you can see the different parameters here for the foliage type. So let's go through what we want to set for our particular tree spawning. So align to normal, we'll check that. What that means is that the tree will grow at the angle of the underlying landscape. If you don't have that, all the trees will grow straight up, which looks a bit unnatural. However, if we obviously go too steep, you're going to have trees growing at a wild angle. So we need to limit the angle at which it can grow out of the landscape. So the maximum angle here, let's make that 15 degrees. So what that means is that wherever that grows, it will try and align it to the underlying landscape slope, but it will never go above 15 degrees in the angle. And then the next thing is, yes, random yaw means we'll get random rotation of the trees. That will look good. And we'll also, here in the ground slope angle, what we're saying is that trees can only grow between the flat landscape and a 45-degree slope. So between 15 and 45 degrees, they'll still only go up 15 degrees, but they will still grow on some of the steeper parts. So let's leave that now. We can always come and change it later on. And then let's move on to this procedural section. This is where the procedural foliage does most of its magic. So we won't go through all of these settings, but the two key ones for now is collision and growth. So collision is nothing to do with players being blocked by trees, although we'll deal with that in a minute. This is to do with how the foliage will be spawned in between the spaces. So the collision radius is the gap between, or the minimum gap between trees, and the shade radius is the distance between where under the canopies of trees other trees can grow. So what I'll do is I'll just expand the shade radius a bit so that the trees are further apart, and in the growth section I need to set the scale of the trees. So what I'm going to do here is say they start at a uniform scale of 1, and as they age they can go up to a maximum of 3 times the size, and this is the age of the trees, so they can go up to 10 years old. So there are all sorts of settings in here you can play with, but I think that will suffice for now. The only last thing I'll do is in the collision presets here, at the moment it's set to no collision. If you're just doing cinematics, this is fine. But if we've got a player running around, we want the trees to block our player. So let's make this block all for our player, and we'll test that out later on. Okay, so that's our basic settings. We may come and tweak those later on. So click on save here. And what we now need to do is we need to create a procedural foliage spawner, which will spawn these trees in a particular area. So what we'll do here is we'll go back to, actually let's set this back to details. go back to the content browser and we'll create a new folder at the top level, and we'll call this, so new folder, we'll call this Procedural Foliage. Open that up, and in this empty folder we need to create a procedural foliage spawner. So right click and foliage, procedural foliage spawner, and we'll call it PFS_trees. And if you open that up, it contains just a small amount of information. Don't worry about these main parameters at the moment, although there's one that we'll change later on. The key thing here is you want to say which foliage types you want to spawn. So if I click plus here, we should only have one foliage type, the one we just created. So let's select that. So this procedural foliage spawner will spawn these object types, these foliage types. Okay, now we need to, so let's save that. Now we need to say where we want to spawn these, and for that we need a procedural foliage volume. So go into the add menu here, go to volumes and find procedural foliage volume, and just drag that over the lake. And now we just need to make some settings and scale for this. So let's just move out a bit here. And what I'll do is I will scale it up. So I'm going to scale it. Let's get rid of the uniform lock here. So I'm going to make it 200 by 200. And I'll make the height 100. Okay. And I don't know if you can see, but there's the sort of volume in which it's going to spawn, but it's a little bit high, so at the moment it's going to do the trees all the way up to almost the top of the hills. So I need to bring the spawner down. So in my original landscape that I created for the cinematics you saw in the trailer, I think I had the Z location at -10687. And if you put that number in, you can see that you've got trees that go up the hill a bit, but then they stop here. I mean, we can adjust this later as well. So let's give this a go. In fact, let's move them around. You can see that it's not quite centered in the lake. So what I can do is I can sort of move it around. Something like that. We're going to make this encompass the whole landscape later. This is really just a sort of starter test. So yeah, let's again, let me just move it over here slightly so it goes on this ridge. Okay, that's probably fine. Let's give that a go. So the next thing we need to do in this procedural foliage volume, in fact, let's change the name. Let's call it PFV_trees, so we remember what it is when we come back to it. And if you go down in the details panel here until you find procedural foliage section, you then say what spawner you want to use in this volume. So if you click down there, we'll have one procedural foliage spawner, PFS trees. You can leave all the other settings as they are, and then you click on resimulate to generate or spawn the trees in that volume. So click on that, and here we have a whole load of trees. So there's a couple of problems, but we're going to solve those in a moment. One of them is that the trees are also in the lake, and the second thing is that they are the wrong color. We want them to be snowy. So let's look at fixing the lake issue first. So with procedural foliage volumes, you can specify where you want them to grow, but you can also specify volumes where you don't want them to grow as well. So what we'll do is we'll put a blocking volume in the lake. So in order to do that, we need to add another element, so another volume, and this is a procedural foliage blocking volume. So put this in the lake, and we will call it PFV trees blocking. And what we'll do here is let's copy the location of the trees. So go to the PFV trees volume, and up at the location here, if you right click, you can do copy. And if you then select the trees blocking and go to the location and do paste, it'll be in the same area. We want to bring the size or the location down, and the scale. Actually, let's make the scale the same. So 200, 200, and the scale for our main volume was 100. So let's make that 20. And let's just see what happens if we resimulate. So go back to your PFV trees. Actually, we may not have specified in our blocking trees which spawner we're blocking. So go back to the PFV trees blocking. And what we want to do is find, the procedural foliage volume here. So for the blocking volume, we have to say the procedural foliage volume that we're blocking. So make sure you select PFV trees here, otherwise it won't know what it's actually trying to block. Right, now go back to PFV trees, and we will do resimulate. And nothing seems to have changed at the moment, or maybe it's just too low. Let's select that blocking and bring it up so you can see where it is here. So I've just moved it so it's just poking out of the lake here. Let's go back to the PFV trees, resimulate. Okay, and then you can see what's happened here. It has now blocked all of the trees that were in the lake, and they're only now on the shore. So that actually looks pretty good. So let's look at another issue here as well. If I go over to, you can see that there's some LOD issues as well, but we'll sort those out in a minute. You can see that things are sort of popping in and out. But if I go to the slope here, let's see if I can show you another issue. Let's go down here. Can you see how, so I just got two there. Can you see how the tree here is actually not sunk into the ground? And this is because we said that the trees can grow anywhere between an angle of 0 and 45 degrees, but we limited the angle of growth to 15 degrees. So these ones on the slope are not able to cover the landscape. So we can fix that quite easily. If you've still got your foliage type open here, if not, just go and find it and open it up. We've got this thing, the parameter here called Z offset. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to raise or sink the foliage into the landscape. In this case, we want to sink it into the landscape. So if we try going down -15, so set both of these, you can do a range, but we're just going to do a fixed value of -15. And once you've entered that in there, go back to your procedural foliage volume and resimulate. And you can see that this tree now is sunk into the ground, and we can no longer see that unsightly gap. So that's all looking pretty good. So now what we want to do is we want to increase the scale so that the foliage covers the whole of the landscape. And we can do that simply by scaling up our procedural foliage volume. So let's go back to the procedural foliage volume here, go up to the top, and what we'll do now is we will center the location. So make this 0 and 0, and then we're going to make the scale 2000 by 2000 on the X and Y. So that will cover the whole of the landscape here. And then if you go down, you can resimulate. Now this will take a bit longer because it has to simulate across the whole of the landscape. And you may not be able to see the trees at the end as well. Depends on the culling settings you've got. So you can see now that we now have the trees in all of the valleys around the landscape. So that's great. Now there's one other little issue that you may notice, and it may bother you and it may not, but if I fly over to this, can you see how there's a pathway between this forest? It's kind of slightly unnatural. You might not mind it, you might think it's like a sort of a path or a road. Now the reason for that is because it generates the procedural foliage in tiles, and the tile value, it was obviously such a parameter that it ended at this point. So we can just up that tile value and get rid of that unsightly seam if we want. So go back to the procedural. So you want to select this procedural foliage spawner trees, open it up, and you can see in these four parameters here, the second one here is the tile size. By default it's 10,000. So what I'll do is I will change this to 40,000, and then if I go back here to my volume and resimulate, after a moment, once it's generated everything, you can see now that seam has disappeared. So we now have the forests with no lines in between or in the middle of the forests. Okay, so that's our tree spawning completed. What we'll do next is we will texture the trees to look more wintry, and we'll fix the LOD issues as well. So now we're going to change our green trees so that they have a snowy, wintry texture to fit in with the landscape. But before we do that, I'm just going to set a camera bookmark here. So you can see that I've moved my camera to a point over the lake where there are trees in the foreground and trees in the background. And I'm just going to hit Control-1 to store that in a bookmark, and then I can come back to that by pressing the 1 key later. So to change our texture, we need to first of all find our tree mesh. So go into the content drawer, and you'll want to go to the spruce forests, meshes, half high, and it was this spruce half 03 that we were working with. So click on that, double click on that to open it up, and I'm going to just move it to the right hand side of the screen, so we've got the so we can see the original scene as well as we make changes. And you can see that this is this has 4 material slots in it for the trunk, branch, leaf, and the imposter. The imposter is the single plane tree that you see in the far distance, and this material is a hierarchy. So what we'll do is we'll go into the leaf material, so just browse to that and double click on it to open it up, move it into my right half, and then if you scroll down you'll see that it has a parent material, spruce half 03 MA. So browse to that, open it up, and then if you now scroll down there you'll see that the final parent in the hierarchy is MA summer, and the summer is the default with the green textures. But if we change this to MA winter, you can see on the left hand side that our foreground trees immediately change to a snowy texture. And if you go up to the snow parameters here, there's various changes we can make here. For example, the one that has a big difference is this snow blending leaf. If I click on that, if I reduce that from 1 to 0, you can see that my trees become extremely white. One is a more subtle view with sort of some light snow on the leaves with a bit of green showing through. So I think I'll leave it with the defaults here, but you'll notice here in our scene that the foreground trees have changed but the background trees haven't, and that's because the background trees are using the imposter material. So save this, close it down, close down the leaf material so you get back to your main mesh. And what we'll do now is we'll browse to the imposter material, go in here, open it up, and you'll see here there are snow parameters. So check the box here and check to allow snow, and you'll see at the background there's some unconvincing sort of snow on the background trees, but we can change some of the settings here. So we can change the brightness and the blending. So let's, if I remove the blending to 0, you see it becomes completely white, but that's too much. So let's make it 0.2, and then we can reduce the brightness a bit. So just take the levels down so it matches. So that's not looking too bad, except that these imposters are coming in, or these sort of background trees are coming in too soon for my liking. If you've got the power in your GPU, you could probably have more of these three-dimensional trees in the foreground. So we'll change the level of detail so that we push these imposter trees into the next valley. So save this, close it down, and come back to your main mesh. And if you go to the LOD section here, LOD picker, if you pick LOD4, this is the imposter, and you'll see the screen size here is set to 0.17. So a higher screen size means that these imposters will appear nearer the camera, and a lower screen size will push them back. So let's change the screen size to 0.05, and you'll see now that the trees are pushed into the next valley. So if I rise up out of the scene here, you can see they're in here, but the foreground trees in around the lake are all the 3D versions. So you'll notice a hit on the frame rate, but if you can cope with it, this is probably a better look for your scene. So the other thing you'll notice here as well is that if I go back to the LOD order here, you can notice that my trees are blowing quite violently. Yours probably are just lightly swaying, and that's because, let's save this, that's because I changed the wind settings in the main material. So if you go again up to go to the leaf material, find the parent MA and go to that, you will see that there are these wind parameters here, and you probably got, let me just show what setting you probably got. It'll just do a recompile here. So while it recompiles the shaders, you probably got this so that there's no movement, or maybe there's a very subtle movement on the tree. So if you add this level 1 wind here, and again once the shaders are compiled, you'll see, let's see if we can zoom in slightly. You'll see there's a very light movement of the trees. It's very subtle, but if you want to make it a more violent movement, as if it's in a gale, if we use this plant or tree checkbox here, it effectively changes this to act as though this was a much lighter plant rather than a tree. So if I click on that, you'll see immediately that these are moving around much more as if it was in a gale. So I'm going to go with that setting. And I would say we are now done with texturing our trees. We can do some finessing later on, but now let's move on and create some rocks in our landscape. We're going to use a procedural foliage technique to spawn our rocks around the landscape as well as the trees. So the first thing we need to do is get some rocks from Quixel Bridge. So go to the Add menu, go to Quixel Bridge, and if you search here for Tundra Stone, and then in the top right here you've got this little filter option, and we can change the sizes to sizes 1 to 2 meters. And the ones I'm using are this one here. They're all called tundra stone or similar. So this third one and this sixth one, they're sort of fairly rounded rather than jagged. So if you select both of those, I've gone for the high quality setting here. So you'll need to download them first. And once they're downloaded, you can click on add and you'll get a couple of new folders in your project for those two stones. Okay, now we'll close everything down, including bridge. And what we want to do next is create the foliage types for those stones. So the easiest way to do that is to go into the foliage mode, use Control Space to bring up your content browser. And if you now go into the Megascans folder 3D assets, you'll have two folders here for both of those stones. So click on the first one, select the mesh and drag it into the foliage, and then select the second folder and again drag that rock up in here until it highlights. And now you can close down your content browser. So now we have these two stones here, or the two foliage types for the stones. Click on save to save them. It will put them in the original folder, that's fine. Save the other one as well. And now what we can do is we can actually adjust these foliage types together to get the same setting. So I'm selecting the first one and then shift select the second one. So you'll see below it says multiple values here because we're adjusting these two rocks to have the same settings. So the density here of 100 is fine. That will work well, I think, for our spawner. The next thing I want to look at is the Z offset. So if you remember when we did the trees, we sunk them into the ground a bit. So let's sink the rock into the ground sometimes. So we'll set this minimum one to -10 and we'll leave the maximum at 0. So the rock will be somewhere between 10 units under the ground randomly up to lying on the ground. That's fine. So we'll leave all the other settings, align to normal, random yaw or rotation, ground slope angle. But what we can do here is we can maybe have a random pitch angle as well. So what we'll do is we'll rotate the rocks so that they sometimes sort of tilt up or tilt down as well. So let's have a random pitch angle up to 45 degrees here. And that's probably sufficient for what we want to do. You could do some adjusting on the scale here as well. So maybe we could have the scale between 0.8 and 1.2 just to give it a little bit of variation. The other thing you might want to do as well, although I won't do it in this particular tutorial, is you might want to set the collision presets to block your player, but you may have to go in and fix the collision meshes. I've shown that before on my Tropical Island series, how to do that. So if you need to do that, you can go and check that out and see how to do collision on your rocks as well. Okay, so we've set up the foliage types. Let's do a Control-Shift-S to save everything. So that will save the level and all of the changes we've made. Let's go back to the main selection. And what we want to do now is we want to create a procedural foliage spawner, just like we did for our trees. So let's come back into the content browser, go to our procedural foliage, and we'll create a new spawner here. So right click, foliage, procedural foliage spawner, and I'll call this PFS_rocks. And if I open that up, what I need to do here is I will add the two foliage types I've just set up for the rocks. So click here twice and select the tundra stone, the two different tundra stones here. Make sure that they've got slightly different values here. So we've got the two different types. Okay, and save that, and we can close that down. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create a volume on the landscape to spawn these rocks. So what we'll do is we'll just zoom out a bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just put it over the lake to start off with, and then once we're happy with it, we'll expand it to cover the whole landscape. So go into the Add menu, Volumes, Procedural Foliage Volume, drag it into the scene over the lake, and then we'll just make some changes here. On the scale, let's change the scale here, make sure it's unlocked so it's not uniform. Let's change the scale to 100 by 100 and a height of 5. And then if you just drag this up, you can see the edges here. So what we'll do is drag it so that it's just there, just underneath the lake here, so that the rocks will spawn on the lake side and just under the lake here. And then we need to go down further in the details panel and select our foliage spawner. So go in here and select the PFS rocks that you just set up, and let's give it a go. Click resimulate, and in fact they are there. Let's go down here and have a look. They're here on the lake edge. The only thing about them at the moment is that they don't look as though they totally fit in with the landscape. We want them to have a slightly snowy texture as well. But in terms of the size and the placement, they look pretty good. So what I'll do now is I will update the foliage volume to encompass the whole of the map. So let's rename this. So we've got, it's called Procedural Foliage Volume at the moment. Click F2 and let's call it PFV Rocks. And in the details panel, go back up to the top, and what we will do is we will centralize the location. So change the location X and Y to 0, 0 to put it in the middle of the map. Change the scale to 2000 by 2000 on the X and Y, leave the height as 5, and now we can go down, click on resimulate, and you probably have to wait probably around about 20 to 30 seconds because it's now going to spawn this across the whole map. And once that's done, if you look around, there'll be rocks all the way around the lake, and indeed all the way around the landscape at that level. So let's move on now and do the final thing for this episode, which is to texture the rocks so that they blend in with the landscape. Before we blend our rock materials, let's just adjust the sunlight here to create a little bit more contrast in our scene. So choose the directional light in the outliner, and I just want to rotate it round and raise it a bit higher in the sky. So the rotation values I'm going to use here are -90, -50 and 90. And you can see we've put it higher in the sky here and created a little bit more sort of shadow on the under the trees here. Okay, now let's do the texture blending on the rocks. So the first thing we need to do, we've done this before on other tutorials, but if you're new to this, I'll go through it from scratch. First thing we need to do is enable virtual texturing for the project. So go to Edit, Project Settings, search for Virtual, and come down until you see this Enable Virtual Texture Support. Click on it and it will ask you to restart, so click Restart Now. Save anything that hasn't been saved on the way out. And then after a minute or so, it will restart your project, and you can see in the bottom right it is recompiling all of the shaders to take advantage of the virtual texture options. So I will pause the video and come back in a second when that's done, and we'll continue. Okay, so the shaders have finished compiling. Let's shut down the project settings. Everything looks pretty much the same as before, but now we can add the runtime virtual texture material and height map that we need to blend in with the rocks. So OpenLand provides a nice widget for setting this up for us. So if we open up the content browser, go into OpenLand widgets, you've got this OpenLand RVT widget. So right click and run this and click on add RVT support, and it gives you a couple of steps to do, which I'll do with you now. So if you go over to the outliner, find RVT volume height, and in the virtual texture select RVT OpenLand height, and then go to your RVT volume material, and in the virtual texture select RVT OpenLand material, and these instructions should disappear, so you can close that down now, and we now have the right setup for doing blending of our rocks. So what we need to do next is we need to update the material for the rocks to take advantage of those runtime virtual textures. So go to your, in fact do a quick save here. Go to your content browser, open up the Megascans 3D assets folder and go to the first stone here, and the first item here is the material instance. So double click on that to open it up. Let's just stick it on the right hand side of the screen so we can adjust it in a minute. And at the moment it has no controls for doing the blending, so what we need to do is in the toolbar at the top just make sure you expand it to see the hierarchy, and you'll see that its parent material is this Megascan default fuzz material. So open that up, put that on the main screen just so we can see everything, and you can see at the moment this is the output of the material for this rock, and indeed for all of the rocks that we've imported. So what we'll do is we will just move that along a bit, and we're going to add a node just before the main material output. Drag out here and type in RVT, and you want OpenLand RVT blend with attributes, and then plug the output in here. And what that'll give us is that'll give us some extra parameters that will use the runtime virtual textures that we've just created to blend in the rocks with the underlying landscape. So click on save here, and we'll probably see a change straight away because I believe the blend parameter is set to 1 by default. So if we come out here, you can see already the rocks look like they are somewhat covered in snow, and actually they're not too far off where we want them. But let's just finesse those parameters to get exactly what we want. So we've got the main stone material, one of the stone material instances over here. If I scroll down, you'll see near the bottom we now have the RVT blending section. So click on the first 3 parameters and the last 2 parameters, and we'll set the blend smoothness to 200, so that'll create a little bit more of the underlying texture here, and then we'll reduce the normal contrast to 0.5 and the normal sharpness to 0.5 as well. So got a slightly smoother setting here, and we'll need to do the same with the other stone as well. So save that one, go back into your 3D assets, go to the next stone and open up that material instance, and then go down and we'll do the same settings here. So select the top 3 and the bottom 2, blend smoothness to 200, normal to 0.5 and normal sharpness to 0.5. And now all of the rocks are blending in the same way, and you can see they look like they are part of that landscape with the snow underneath. So it's been quite a lengthy episode, this one, but we'll leave it there for now. And don't forget to save your settings. In the next episode, we are going to create 2 types of mist, a planar mist that's good for cinematics and a volumetric mist that's suitable for in-game use. So stay subscribed and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.